right, ladies and gentlemen, it is no surprise at all that we need a new tier list. And this tier list is going to be focused on one mode in particular. It's going to be Whimpering Wastes. And believe me when I say that this is potentially one of the most challenging endgame modes you're ever going to have in this game, depending on who you have on your roster. That's because, well, if you're using a lot of the characters in here that are tier 0 for something like the Tower of Adversity, well, using this as a benchmark for Whimpering Wastes isn't really the best thing to do, because it turns out that a lot of the characters that you might be seeing here, like Jinhsi, Carlotta, or Phoebe, they're really not that good in this game mode. And so what I'm going to be doing today is making a tier list of my own. And this tier list is going to be focused entirely on this AoE focused endgame, because a lot of characters, right, that don't necessarily have as much value are going to be extremely strong in this mode. Things like grouping, things like AoE, things like really fast rotation times. They're a lot more important here than they would be in things like, well, rotation times are important in the tower, but you know what I'm talking about. So with that, we're going to be ranking all of the different characters. We're going to be going by release date too, and we're just going to go ahead and place them from S all the way down to C. So let's get right on into it. The first character that we're going to have up is, of course, Jiyan. And let me just say that Jiyan is the easiest S tier I've ever seen in this game mode. The fact of the matter is that there's a lot of components of Jiyan's kit that make him absolutely insane. The first one being that, well, his liberation, right? His dragon twirl, his dragon dance, that groups, it does a shit ton of damage. It has a very low cooldown. And, well, it's going to carry you through pretty much every single encounter in this game mode. He doesn't need to have a lot of sequence nodes. He can literally use, and let me just show you an example of what I used in my endgame clear. He can literally use his launch team from a 1.0 along with a powerful token like this that's going to increase his crit rate and crit damage. And as you can see from my infinite feats, Brotherman cleared 9 rounds the first time I ever used him, and that is enough to get the full rewards from this endgame mode. And you can see over here my Xiangli Yao team that I didn't play that well, barely was able to sort of carry him, or was barely able to drag their side over the finish line. It was Jiyan that did most of the work here. And believe me when I say, everything about his kit is designed for this mode. One part that makes him shine particularly well is how Jiyan's Forte Circuit works. Jiyan's Forte Circuit essentially deals a massive nuke of damage, right? You're seeing this massive nuke that he can do when he has his Forte Circuit before casting his Liberation, Emerald Storm Finale. This hits multiple times across his rotation, and what it also does is if it clears a wave with the initial hit, the damage will stay there and actually affect a second wave that's coming in. And the end result is that he basically will start spawn killing waves of enemies just from using his Forte Circuit. And it's absolutely nuts for getting a lot of mileage out of the mode. You combine that with the fact that this guy is very low budget with the team that he runs, and Mortefi is always on his banner, you're going to have an absolute dream using him on one side. And it's going to be an experience that, well, not a lot of other teams are going to be able to compare to unless they have multiple 5-star limited characters or other high-value characters or sacrificing damage. Jiyan sacrifices nothing to get his grouping, to get his damage, and to get good clears. And he's pretty cheap doing it at the same exact time. Next up, we're going to have the next 1.0 character, the one released in the second half. And this one is going to be, ladies and gentlemen, Yinlin. And so you might be thinking, oh, Yinlin can't be that good. But she is. The reason why Yinlin is so good, ladies and gentlemen, is because Yinlin charges up her Forte Circuit. She charges up her Concerto. She does everything faster the more enemies there are. And that is because, ladies and gentlemen, when Yinlin uses her resonance skill, she marks enemies, and as she uses more and more heavy attacks, she's going to follow up, right, with this electromagnetic blast damage. And as you can see, even at a level 9 skill, this doesn't deal that much damage, but what it does is that it increases her Forte Circuit, it increases her Concerto generation for every enemy she hits. And when she does that heavy attack, right, where she swirls around, she swirls Zapstring around. It is insane how fast she gains Concerto, insane how fast her rotation times are, and she can apply that Forte Circuit and its coordinated attacks an insane number of times. However, you do have to get used to playing her properly, because your rotation times are going to be nothing like what you experience in the tower. It's going to be a lot faster, and you have to adjust the way that you're playing. And when you combine this with something like the new coordinated attack set, and she's going to always have her Forte Circuit in these AoE situations, well, you're going to be dealing a good bit of damage. The only unfortunate part is that, well, her coordinated attacks will end after you destroy the enemy with the mark on them. They're not going to persist through that, but it'll still be something that you're constantly having access to in your rotations. And especially if you combine her with a character like Xiangli Yao, who can basically nuke the outgoing wave with his massive damage, you'll get some pretty good results with the team. On my end, just didn't play that team particularly well because it was my first time trying it out. But the power is there. So that's why we're going to be putting Yinlin in S tier 2. Because especially compared to a character like Zhezhi, who's far more single target, Yinlin excels and has massive benefits in AoE that really no other character has. She might be the only character in the game that literally gets all of her resources faster from operating in AoE. Next up, we've got Jinhsi. We've got the character released in 1.1, Jinhsi and Changli. And let me just say that for Jinhsi, gotta be like a B or A. It kind of has to be like a B or an A. This character does not feel good in this endgame mode at all. She is one of the worst characters you can possibly play. She worked in Pincer Maneuver Warriors, where the enemies didn't have that much health, and she was able to obliterate them during the buildup of her incarnation state. But now that the enemies actually have a significant amount of health in this game mode, it does feel like she needs to use her skill to kill them. But if she is using her skill, she's overkilling them by a massive amount. And her Liberations nuke alone isn't enough to be clearing the waves. She requires a character like Yinlin, who is basically dealing all of the extra damage required to work well. And so when you pair Yinlin with Jinhsi, you have a lot of potential to clear. But in that situation, it's really Yinlin doing everything. It's kind of just Yinlin doing everything here. Does the JJC nuke? So the Jinhsi jump cancel is a way to get to her nuke a lot faster. The problem is that her nuke still has a cooldown. Her nuke still has a cooldown of 8 seconds, and if you're using the Jinhsi jump cancel, you're basically not doing any damage outside of the nuke, and you're doing damage every 8 seconds. And you're also making it a lot mechanically harder, and you're losing damage across the rest of your rotation from the skills and the abilities. Jinhsi's baseline damage across her incarnation state, along with Yinlin's AoE, allows you to clear the waves without using your skill. But this is the thing. Jinhsi requires a hypercharged DPS character or a hypercharged sub DPS to help her out in this game mode. She is not clearing it solo, and she's not clearing it with like a Yan Wu. There is just not enough damage, and you have to time your attacks, and you're going to be overkilling a shit ton. And it just does not feel good. She feels great in the tower, but believe me when I say no bueno here. Just not what you want. Changli. You guys might be surprised by this, but Changli's probably going in S tier. The reason why is that pretty much every single one of Changli's attacks, aside from her Air True Sight, actually deals a lot of AoE damage. Every single thing she does is basically AoE, and it hits in a circle around her. Her Forte Circuit is a massive circle around her. Her Liberation is another massive circle around her. And the end result is that if she's well invested in, her lack of sustained damage isn't really an issue, because things like her Forte Circuit into like a Liberation into another Forte Circuit will clear waves on its own. And when you pair her with a second DPS, let's just say somebody like Xiangli Yao, and you don't use Quick Swap, you'll still just deal enough damage in an AoE to clear all the waves without really that massive amount of skill investment. And it only gets better the more you invest in that quick swapping ability. She doesn't need to be played super sweaty to do decently in the game mode. And you can even, think about, especially with the release of Brand in the future, maybe combining some of that capability as well. But her massive focus on AoE, her constant uptime on all of her damaging abilities, makes her one of the most consistent clearers in the game. And honestly, a pretty well-used pick. She's a lot better in this game mode than she is in the TOA for the average player. You don't need to play her super sweaty to get good results. Next up, we've got Zhezhi. Fuck this character. Fuck this character in this game mode. she is quite possibly she is not good because her coordinated attacks are all single target. All of her attacks are pretty much single target with a small AoE, and she's basically just a buffer. But the only characters she buffs well are Jinhsi and Carlotta, who are both not that good in this game mode. They're both just not that good in this game mode. Her really heavy focus on single target and bossing is great in the TOA, but in here, my gosh, you're gonna be missing a lot of the AoE damage that you need to make up for the single targetness of her main DPSs. And well, you can try using her in the final stages. You probably will clear at high investment, but it's a rough time. It's a really, really, really rough time. Next up, we got Xiangli Yao, and I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna put in Xiangli Yao in A. The reason for that is that Xiangli Yao kind of has a couple of issues in that he has the same overkilling problem that Jinhsi does on the initial cast of his liberation, but he does have more AoE to make up for it. However, if you are playing Xiangli Yao as a hyper carry in this team comp and you don't have Yinlin, you're gonna notice that, well, your hypercubes aren't kind of going to kill the enemies outright, and you might have to use 2 hypercubes on a single wave. It's a bit of an issue if you don't have like that reliable off-field damage that you might be getting from a character like Yinlin, or the swapping that you would get from a character like Changli. He has a couple of problems, and his lack of damage on the follow-up and the increased HP of the enemies, it's different from pincer maneuver warriors. He doesn't just blow out the waves like he would in pincer, and it's not as good as it was in the prior patches. So without Yinlin, Yao is not that great, but with Yinlin, he's very, very, very good. And I think at a baseline, he's just going to be better than a character like Jinhsi because he has way more consistent damage overall to the waves, and let's just be honest, way better AoE. It's Yinlin carrying the team with this lineup. Next up, we got Shorekeeper. We got the support. And I'm just going to be a little bit honest when I say that Shorekeeper is an S, but she doesn't feel that much more relevant than a character like Verina. She is strong, but her rotation time is kind of long. She does have the grouping, and this is the main thing, guys. You also have, on the very difficult stages for clearing, you have this token that increases your crit rate by 40% and crit damage by 80%. And so if you really do have a team that needs crit, this is better, right? This is better than Shorekeeper. This is like Shorekeeper Supermax in token form. And so while she does have built-in grouping in her kit, it's like you don't want to spend any time on your support in this game mode. You want to be constantly dealing damage. It's not like the tower, right? Where you have like downtime in your rotation where the enemy might be like attacking or doing like annoying dodging shit. So being on Shorekeeper isn't really a problem. But when you have a game mode where the goal is to be constantly doing damage all the time to clear as many waves as possible, well, her extended rotation time, specifically on the first rotation, is a bit of an issue, and her buffs really aren't as relevant as they need to be. And so I do think that she's either at the bottom of S or maybe at the top of A, simply because she is a support. And you can also think about it this way, guys. Her outro damage, it's a nice to have. It's a cool little nuke. It's not going to be dealing enough damage to wipe the wave, and it's not as fast as Verina to get up her next rotation. And so I do think Verina, I'm just going to go ahead and rank Verina alongside her. Verina is better. Verina is probably the best support in this game mode. Her incredibly fast rotation time just lets you do a lot more damage to all these different waves than Shorekeeper will. And the buffs that you have, especially if Verina's S2 and has that faster rotation time, combined with the token buffs that you can get in-game, I'm gonna be honest, Verina with this is better than Shorekeeper with this. So that's gonna be that ranking. Next up, we have Camellya. I think Camellya is slightly worse than Jiyan, but still better than every other character. 1,000,000%. Because her in Blossom mode, insane, right? You'll clear a wave with all of your outro skill buffs on from like the healer and like a Sanhua or a Roccia. You'll clear the wave with Blossom mode, then you'll ephemeral and then instantly nuke the entire second wave, and then you'll go back into budding form, spin again, and then clear another 2 waves maybe. She's solid, right? She's solid. She has a pretty long rotation time. The only thing is that, well, her downtime can kind of have some issues as well. If you get hit out of ephemeral, that can be a skill issue thing that occurs and really eat into your clear time. That and, you know, sometimes her liberation and her rotations can be kind of ER reliant, and enemies can just walk out of her blossom mode. And it's not like Jiyan, where Jiyan can dodge in the middle of his rotation and still be fine in the clear. Camellya, if she has to dodge, her uptime on the damage is kind of bad. I don't know if you guys have noticed that, but if you dodge in blossom mode and then you start attacking again, it feels kind of fucking slow. And the best way it feels to play this character is to just spin and then never stop spinning. But if you're against enemies like the golems or you're against enemies like the bears, it's a little bit rough. And Jiyan has no problem at all just nuking enemies, dodging whatever he needs to, and then continuing back on his attacks. And his grouping CCs the enemies too. So that's why I'm putting Jiyan a little bit higher. They're both at extremely powerful levels, but I do think Jiyan is a lot more reliable, especially while he's on field, compared to Camellya, who has some issues with enemies walking out, issues with dodging in the middle of her spin, and issues with getting interrupted during ephemeral, that it's far more likely to happen with all the different enemies on the field. All right, so that's going to be all of the 1.0 characters, some of the limited ones. Let's go ahead and get into our 2.0 characters. And, well, you guys might not be happy with some of the rankings. Carlotta is going in B with Jinhsi. Let's be honest, guys. This character is not that good in AoE. This character is not that good in AoE. She has about 2 abilities that deal AoE damage. She has her Forte Circuit heavy attack, and then she has the initial shot of her liberation and the final shot of her liberation. That can, in some scenarios, with a lot of practice, a lot of timing, a lot of proper positioning, you can insta-kill some waves, you can get a decent amount of damage in, you can, like, save the death knell shots for when there's, like, the 2 or 3 elites. But let's be honest here, guys. If we're going to factor in things like ease of use, if we're going to factor in how many resets you need to do, if we're going to factor in how frustrating it is, Jinhsi and Carlotta have to be some of the most frustrating characters. You can clear with them, but clearing with them is annoying. Clearing with them requires a lot more work, a lot more understanding of the character's mechanics, and a lot more sweaty gameplay to actually clear the waves and get through all the content. And believe me when I say that these are some of the easiest characters to play, in the Tower of Adversity, but oh my gosh, they have so many issues with overkilling, dealing too much damage, or lacking AoE when it matters in this Whimpering Wastes game mode. So there's a reason why so many people are struggling with Whimpering Wastes. They'll bulldoze the tower with the combination of these 3 characters because they're like the boss destroyers, and they won't be able to get similar results because that sort of playstyle does not work in Whimpering Wastes. There's a reason why so many people are complaining about it and saying that it's not a good endgame mode. It's because they are using characters tailored for the tower, and these guys are just not good. They are not good compared to these guys. And that's where, right, that reliance on a tier list like this, which is specifically geared towards the Tower of Adversity, can and has led to some people having the wrong impression about Whimpering Wastes. So do keep that in mind. You can make these characters work, but it's a lot harder, a lot more work than all of the other characters we're seeing up here. And of course, since we covered that, it's time to get into Roccia. Tier 0. 1,000,000% tier 0. I honestly believe that Whimpering Wastes was almost designed for this character because it's fair to say that Roccia is not that high value in the TOA, where grouping doesn't really matter that much. Her extended field time is a bit of an issue in the TOA compared to Sanhua, but Roccia, with 2 forms of grouping, one during her initial rotation and then another one when her main DPS takes the field, it's good, it's solid. The only problem is that, well, she's expensive. She is fucking expensive. You need to pull her. You need to get a decent crit weapon for her to be decent to build. And you also need a DPS that works with her. And let me just say that while Havoc Rover did get a massive buff, Havoc Rover sucks ass in AoE. They're fucking awful. They are actually one of the worst AoE characters I've ever seen. And the way for this character, Roccia, to feel good is to have a Camellya. That's kind of it. You can try using Havoc Rover with Roccia in this game mode, and you probably will get it after a couple of tries, but if you're not using Blossom Mode Camellya with Roccia, it kind of doesn't feel that good. And there needs to be recognition of that here. You could even replace some of these two. You could theoretically think about putting her over here. It's just, Yinlin is almost brainless with what you're doing. And Yinlin kind of just is like passive background damage. Roccia is like, unless if you're using her with Camellya, she's above Yinlin. But if you're using Roccia not with Camellya, she's probably lower. But we'll just go ahead because most players that pulled Roccia had Camellya. We'll just leave her here for now. There needs to be a recognition of her strength in grouping for sure. 1,000,000%. All right. So that's going to cover every character from 1.0 to 2.0. Now let's get into the first release of 2.1. Phoebe sucks. Phoebe's so fucking bad in this game mode. It's ridiculous. I've never seen a character who is so bad in multi-wave content other than this. And you want to know why? I'll show you guys exactly why this character is no bueno. When it comes to Phoebe, this heavy attack Star Flash is the main damage in her kit, right? Pretty good, 82.69 times 3. When she's in Absolution, which is basically her only viable state at this current point in the game, if the target's hit have Spectral Frazzle, the skill gains 256% damage amp. So that basically means, unless you have Spectral Frazzle on them, the skill basically loses a massive amount of fucking damage. And guess what, guys? There is no way to apply Spectral Frazzle from off-field other than switching to a character to apply it, then switching back to Phoebe. You can only do that on Spectral Rover every 6 seconds. And so let's just say you go to Spectral Rover, you heavy attack, apply the Frazzle, then go back to Phoebe. It's like, okay, now I have to like do my three attacks on Phoebe, do the heavy attack, and then go back to Spectral Rover. It's just a little clunky. It's a little clunky, and you have to swap so much, and then you're gonna have like mixed uptime, and the enemies aren't gonna spawn with Frazzle. It just doesn't feel good to play. It can definitely work, but it just feels really weird. The last thing is, well, her viability should shoot up dramatically if she ever gets a support that will apply Frazzle from off-field without her needing to swap. If she gets a support like that, she feels a lot better. But the fact that she needs to switch to somebody else, apply the Frazzle, and then switch back, especially in an AoE situation where the AoE on Spectral Rover's enhanced skill isn't that high, it's a little rough. It is a little fucking rough. It's not that good. And I would say that this character needs a different kind of support, a different kind of sub DPS. Again, somebody that can apply Spectral Frazzle from off field to feel better in this game mode. But for now, I would say that she kind of feels like worse. She feels worse than Carlotta, and she feels worse than Jinhsi. I think it's ironic that they brought her out in a state like this because she is just not that good in the endgame mode. She is just not that good. So with that, that's going to be all of the limited characters that we're going to be seeing for Whimpering Wastes. I think I've covered them pretty okay. This is just from my initial testing, but it's pretty clear that AoE focused characters, maybe that aren't as good in single target, are going to be awesome in this game mode. And so with that, I wanted to talk about some other characters on the roster, specifically some of the highlights and the lowlights. Encore sucks. Do not use this character. This character is going to be an absolute nightmare for you in this game mode. She does not have the AoE that is going to allow you to clear comfortably. You're going to have to put her with a grouper, and then her damage is going to suffer immensely. I do not recommend her at all. She is far better in the TOA, and, well, she still gets outperformed there, but she's a standard character. How Char, he goes into bottom of B. He actually has a lot of AoE damage, and with enemies being hit lock stunnable, he can work. However, he's incredibly difficult to play, even in this sort of content, and you also have to think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. Well, you could always just use Xiangli Yao, and you're probably going to get better results with him. However, right, if you do use him in dual DPS, maybe with a character like Changli, you will be able to get a decent amount of mileage out of him. So I think that recognition should be there. His Liberation also hits in a massive AoE around him and deals a pretty decent amount of damage too. Next up, Jiyan. Pretty good, I would say so myself. The thing is, if you combine Jiyan with Xiangli Yao, you can get a good amount of stuff going. Jiyan has grouping, Jiyan has a lot of potential, and if you are actually slotting her in with damage, she might be able to clear a wave by herself, right? While your DPS is like waiting for cooldowns, doing something like that. And I would say the fact that she has grouping, the fact that her grouping, when fully built, will deal a decent amount of damage, and she has a liberation buff, which works for so many characters on the roster, buffing liberation damage. I think that she is, if you do have her invested into, a very solid pick that's going to get a lot done for you. Her grouping lasts a pretty long time as well. So imagine that you group with her, you switch to a nuker, you nuke the entire wave with the Xiangli Yao liberation, and her grouping is still on the field for when you're doing his hypercubes. That is definitely a combination you can look for here. And she can also sustain if that's what you're looking for while providing that grouping on the side. And if you're overkilling enemies with a Xiangli Yao, maybe try out a Jiyan Xin, Yinlin, and Xiangli Yao team. That could be something that might work out for you. Lin Yang, you already know this guy he's going to be so trash in here. It's going to be ridiculous. He's not usable. Brant, can't rate him yet. But after looking at his kit, he might actually be okay after looking at his kit, but we'll find out later. Dan Jin, what are you doing? What are you doing? She's going to die. You have like 17 enemies that are attacking you. You're at 1 HP. You're just going to die playing this character. Don't even try it. Alto, he's one of the most useless characters you've ever seen in AoE. One of the most useless characters that is in the game for AoE situations. Shisha, get out of here. You're going to boom boom a single target when 7 or 8 of them are spawning at once. You're going to use boom boom on one target. Just stop it. Get some help. Yanwu, whatever, right? We're not going to really look at any of the other characters on here. Lumi's like a D. Like, these characters are all just not good. Lumi, maybe if you're using her as a nuker with her liberation and you use her like once in a while, but the rest of her attacks are so single target they're bad. Yang Yang will go in the top. Actually, Yang Yang will go in A. Yang Yang will go in A. The reason why Yang Yang is going to go in A is because she has less grouping than a character like Jiyan Xin, but she has incredibly fast rotations and she has constant access to her grouping. She has grouping on her skill. She has grouping on her liberation. She has, again, really fast concerto and attacks. And at S6, right, she provides a buff too. She's a solid character. She can actually deal decent damage as well. And if you're combining her, right, maybe with a Carlotta, or just another character that requires enemies to be a little bit more grouped up for them to hit multiple targets, she's going to basically shore up those weaknesses and make characters like this them feel a lot more playable. But for now, for the rest of the characters, we might just rate Spectral Rover. I would say Spectral Rover goes into B. The problem is they just don't do enough damage. But they are the only source of frazzle that can work with Phoebe. But they just don't do that much damage by themselves. And Havoc Rover, I would say Havoc Rover probably goes into B as well. Sanhua, she's more of a buffer. I'm hesitant on putting more of like the buffers in here because it's more so a focus on the DPS. Like, you're not really looking at the massive amount of damage that these characters are doing. But if you did want to put the buffers on the list, you probably put Mortefi into here just because he's with Jiyan. You probably put Sanhua into here because she works with Camellya. Yeah, that's probably it. And the rest of these characters, just not really worth rating. Not really worth rating at all. I would just put them at like booty, basement, bargain bin tier. They're just not that good. So this is going to be my Whimpering Wastes game mode tier list. When you look at this tier list as a whole, the way that I would read it is Verina is going to be your best in-slot support, right? She is going to be the character that you want to pair with like your weakest team or the team that's struggling the most to clear and use her as the support because her incredibly fast rotation time is going to just go ahead and make everything you need to do a lot faster and have you doing damage a lot more. Jiyan's going to be the best overall DPS for the game mode because, well, ladies and gentlemen, he combines massive AoE damage with massive grouping and has very high uptime on all of his abilities. And when you combine it with something like Verina, and of course the faster rotation time of Mortefi, you are mowing through waves like butter. It's fucking insane. Camellya, on the other hand, has a little bit more clunk, requires a little bit more support from her team in the grouping category, has a couple of issues that can come up in the middle of the clear that Jiyan doesn't really have, but she does deal a competitive, if not more, damage while going through her rotations. However, her ephemeral can do things like overkill. Her enemies can run out of her blossoms, and it's a little bit rough. Rossia's grouping is incredible. Yinlin's AoE damage and her improved resource gain is incredible. And Changli, right? Everything she does is AoE, and you don't need a player as sweaty to get decent results. Next up in A, Shorekeeper is just going to be like, all right. She has great buffs, great performance in the TOA, but it's just not that useful because of her greater rotation time in Whimpering Wastes. However, it is fair to mention that she does have some grouping built into her kit, so maybe it would make sense to put her at the bottom of S. But for now, this is more so to highlight that Verina is just a lot better than her in this game mode, especially if Verina's S2. I think the rest of the tier list is pretty self-explanatory. I just wanted to explain some of the top spots and why Shorekeeper is where she is. And, you know, I think the explanations that we gave for everything else make a ton of sense here. So with that, good luck in this game mode. Build some of the characters that you maybe haven't built before, because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? when it comes to Whimpering Wastes, it gives the same exact rewards, right? If not more than the TOA. And it resets in the same time interval, 30 days. And so you might as well view this game mode as important as the TOA, if not more. And it's going to make a lot of sense to invest in your roster accordingly. So hopefully this guy was helpful. Let me know what you all think. Peace out.